I'm also a notary public. Thanks, Joe. Appreciate it. This crowd reminds me when, nothing really changes in our business. It just cycles back around. When I was first starting out, E.K. Gaylord was not a statue. He was a real person. And he sent out a note to Channel 4, which was owned by the Oklahoma Publishing Company in those days, and saying, you got to come down and cover the Rotary Club every week. But we never do anything important, so don't bring any film. It's just going to be free food, but you got to show up. So I was there one day, pretending like I was taking pictures. And, of course, I sat down for the free food because what journalist wouldn't? I know that's why you're here today. Come on. And Gaylord comes in late. And instead of heading to the head table, he sits down next to me, and it's right about dessert time. And you know those convention luncheons that they always had, like cherries and heavy cream? Well, Mr. Gaylord takes a bite, and everybody's looking at him, and he goes, great strawberries! And all these captains of industry go, great strawberries, E.K.! And he turns to me, 23 years old, and goes, how many people here think of themselves as reporters? And how many people think of themselves as picture makers? Do we have editors? Educators? We know that, right? Well, forget about your titles because it's all changed. The only thing that's important today is the title of storyteller. For about the last 15 years, the only jobs we could really get in both newspapers and television were jobs that screamed headlines. And even today, that's what people do. I mean, they say, this happened 2 seconds ago, and we have it here on MSNBC. This happened 3 minutes ago, and we've got it here on the Oklahoman's page. We've been doing some research at NBC, and we found that your average news consumer, somebody who turns on TV or listens to radio or reads the paper, cannot tell the people who ask the question where they first heard anything. So they don't know whether the Oklahoman reported it first, and they don't know if it was on Channel 4. It's just all around them all day long. So from a competitive standpoint, from your career standpoint, how are we going to survive people with cell phones and YouTube accounts? Right? Over and over and over again, that's the problem. Well, the one thing we all have that the person who with the camera does not have is the ability to tell a story over and over again and tell it well. But we sometimes forget that because it's so complicated what we're doing today. I mean, people who think of themselves as newspaper reporters are now trying to figure out how to set up their laptop and maybe shoot some video. And some of you guys that got into television because you just wanted to be Darrell Barton, and take great pictures, are now finding that you have to file 2,000 words for the newspaper or for your web page and all that kind of stuff. We have a saying in New York City, there's always somebody with 8 hours sleep and has an idea for you. So what are you going to do? I just got back from Ireland, and in Dublin, a town of about the size of Oklahoma City, I think, they've got like a half a dozen newspapers that are still thriving and radio and TV stations that are doing well. So I was talking to a reporter in a bar, imagine that, and I said, what did you all do? And they said, well, we watched how everything else was going in the world, and we decided that people used to buy newspapers for only one thing because it reflected their worldview, but now all the cable yackers could give them their worldview. But what if we went out and found out-of-work novelists, and he says there's a lot of them here in Ireland, and then brought them on the newspaper and in the TV and put them on the rim and swallowed our pride a little bit and have them tell us what we're doing wrong and telling a story. He says, for instance, the other day I was covering a murder, and I wrote the story up, and we were pasting it in the newspaper, and we had this out-of-work novelist who was working the front page, and he goes, he got knifed, right? Yeah. He raised the knife? That's where you switch from page 1 to page 2. He says, that's what I would do in my book, if I'm through with chapter 13, I want you to read chapter 14. You can't assume that people are going to be reading because they love your work. And secondly, he said, here on the sports page, for instance, when I was there was a big World Cup going on in soccer. So obviously every person in Ireland who was interested in sports had watched the game. Every person had listened to every radio and television interview. And now the newspaper or the web page was going to come out 3 hours later. So I read the newspaper account of it, and then I picked up another newspaper account of it, and it was like reading different authors. Even if you knew some of the information or even all of the information, it was like picking up a Patterson murder book. You just like the way they write it. So people in Dublin, according to this reporter, were picking up newspapers based on the way they were written. Storytelling. This is the one thing we lose sight of, because it's like putting up a circus tent every day, except that people assume that we're going to have the tent up. And we go off to, coffee shops and pat each other on the back and say, did you see we got that story all the way from yep. But they really show up for the trapeze act inside, and that's what we're giving ourselves like 3 minutes to do, because it's so difficult to put all this stuff up. This hasn't changed. This hasn't changed since I came here back when the earth was cooling. It hasn't changed since the cavemen went down and watched some mastodon getting beat up down in the valley and then came back, the Channel 4 cave. But there was a reason for that, because they were storytelling. And so I submit that if all we're trying to do is to be as good as the town crier that we've been in the last, because nobody out there in our great viewer and readership can understand whether it was on Channel 4 or wherever. So we've got to get back to basics. I'm not going to tell you anything in this next hour that you don't really know deep at heart. But you may have forgotten. Well, we all know who, what, when, where, and why. But I submit that one of the things you need to do when you get lost and you're trying to turn out things fast for lots of media that you may not be really good at, but you've got to do it because, that's what the boss says. Hey, you see so. If you get lost in doing a story, everything starts with that. Hey is get their attention. Patterson has somebody dead on page 1, right? Hey, did you hear about this? You is what is often overlooked. Immediately in your story, you say, this isn't about the legislature. It's about you. It may have been a train that derailed in Pakistan, but this is where I connect it to you in Edmond. C are the 2 or 3 points that you found in your 20 seconds of reporting, because that's all the time you got now, that might be different than the competition. And so is why should you care? Hey, you see so. And in this day and age where everybody's spinning everything, you go to the school board and they tell you how to do your story. And then they ladle on 16 pounds of research that they, not really research, it's all propaganda, and you get lost in your piece. If you remember, hey, you see so, you can rob some time from your day to actually do some storytelling. For instance, I've got a piece here that somebody sent out a press release from Lincoln Center and said, there's a guy who grew up out on a farm and he's going to be starring tonight at the Metropolitan Opera. His name is Charles Taylor. And he has this and he has that. And instead, using hey, you see so, we came up with this piece.
In most of the country, time is cut in tiny slices, too thin for thought. But out here, on the high plains, the rhythm of life is different. From dawn to dusk, Chuck Taylor would listen to the radio and wonder why he wasn't making music.
Look around you, there's beauty and music everywhere. I wanted to do my part. I wanted to express what I was feeling.
He also thought it might be a good way to meet girls.
I wanted to be a rock star, but Meatloaf already kind of conquered the chubby long-haired guy thing back in the 70s.
So one day, the farmhand from Centennial, Colorado, auditioned for something else. Elizabeth Elliott, the opera director in Fort Collins, was stunned.
Brought tears to my eyes. It's not often that somebody comes in and sings something that just makes your spine straighten, and it wasn't just the voice. Chuck has soul.
Just 18 months after this first role in Colorado, he won a national audition to sing full-time at the Metropolitan Opera in New York City. The only Italian he knew was double latte.
I'm a college dropout. I was a high school dropout before that. I could barely read them little black dots on the page.
You're a Metropolitan Opera singer. You can't. How do you do it?
I hire somebody or have a good enough friend that plays piano to plunk down the notes on a mini disc recorder for me.
Talent got him here. Hard work put him center stage. This month, 6 years after leaving the farm, Chuck, now Charles Taylor, has a leading role in the largest opera house in the world.
I still fight with the feeling of being a fraud.
But he has lived the kind of life they write about in operas.
I should be dead, or at the very least probably in jail or in a box somewhere, begging change. And here I am living this dream.
Taylor loved hitting high notes, but loved getting high better. He was kicked out of school for drinking, started taking drugs, eventually ended up homeless and living in a van. At 24, after the deaths of several of his friends, he hit bottom.
I really thought I was helpless and hopeless.
Take time, go back.
Until music became his lifeline.
So you're trying to woo this chick, right? So, woo me.
Chuck is also teaching at Colorado State University, the school he did not graduate.
It's better. It's better, yeah.
You're one big Cinderella to them. You should see me in a tutu.
Do you know Ricky Martin?
See, he has learned to have fun without drugs. Not serious, but sober 11 years. Chuck even found that girl he went looking for when he left the farm and managed a storybook ending.
Chuck is the kind of guy that people want to be around.
Just to see what will happen next.
So what are you going to do when the fat lady sings on your opera career? I'm going to get back home, get back out here.
Where the rivers twist and turn, a mirror of his life. The one that could have ended tragically, like the operas he sings. For today, Bob Dotson, NBC News, with an American story in New York City.
That started with a press release. Come see the farm kids sing. And some people came and did live shots on the local station, and they asked him a couple of questions, and none of them found out that he was homeless. And nobody found out that he was on drugs. And I found it out because I have a little technique that I use when you have to do all these things real fast and work for the internet, the newspaper, and all that sort of thing. I call it the rule of threes. People always answer your questions in the way that they think you, for the information they think you would like to have. In other words, they give you an answer, and then they explain their answer. That's the second part. But as journalists, we're too quick now, especially in this fast-paced day and age, to jump in with another question. When in fact, we all know that silence is the best tool we've got. So if you just wait a beat, they answer the question they think you've asked, they explain their answer, you let the silence build, They get nervous, and they say, well, dummy, that's why I shot my wife. Not only do you have a new story point, like, guess what? I was homeless. But you also have a great soundbite. And by using the rule of threes, I am always able to find a better opening line. I used to waste time all the time thinking, what would Charles Kuralt do? What would all the guys I like writing do? And then I realized maybe this new technology will help because I don't have to write my story from the beginning. You remember, hey, you see so? I start on the so. I find the 2 or 3 points that I know that maybe most people don't know, or some shading of 2 or 3 points, and I start there. Because if my boss tells me at the last minute, I'd like to shave 30 seconds off or a half a column, I can just toss out the middle. But while I'm going through trying to find out those so points, or C points rather, then what I can do is I can find the sound bites that gave me a lump in the throat. I mean, all good sound bites have to move you emotionally. They have to make you mad, make you cry, whatever, right? But in a story, like you've done your longest piece for the newspaper, now you're doing other little smaller pieces. Maybe the smaller pieces, you don't have time for all the sound bites that really worked for you. So you take the second best sound bite, you paraphrase it, and that's your opening line. So if you think of yourself primarily as a picture taker, I remember I mentioned Darrell Barton, who is a world-class photographer from Oklahoma City, started about the same time I did at Channel 4. And he and I went out to cover some festival. And he was there early in the morning, and I came to pick up his film, and I was going to write his story and run back, put it on the noon news. And we'd had these arguments all along. I'm not a storyteller, I'm a picture maker, da-da-da-da, back and forth. And I said, well, Darrell, what do you have on film? And he said, he looked around this crowd of all these drunks laying out there, and he says, well, breakfast was either smoked or passed around in a bottle. I said, Darrell, there's your opening line. And I'm going to steal it. And it actually matches the pictures you have. That's the biggest problem for people who come up from the newspaper side, is to start to think visually. Start to think about transitions. Where do you go from here? Where are the pictures? And the hardest part from the people from the television side is to start thinking in terms of detail. Because let's face it, we've stolen stories from them for years. We just want to fill the front page, that they had. And so, but basically, I mean, remember back in the 70s, there was a comedian named Flip Wilson, right? Some of you older people might remember, but his great line was, he said, we may have come over on different ships, but we in the same boat now. And so there we are. Writers become picture takers become writers. Still photographers have to learn how to do video, vice versa. And so it becomes really daunting. The trick is to recall that in order to survive in this business, and I've done it for almost 40 years, you don't have to be great. You just have to be better than the other guy. And that's not hard, because even the stuff that you're really not good at, if you look at it as just building blocks. All right, here's my natural sound. Here's my picture. Here are my details. Here are my lines. And then you figure out which goes where. And after a while, it's like, like learning basketball routines. You can figure it out because you've broken down the big mystique. Like, how will I do it? I'll never be able to do it. Well, it's simple if you break it down into little bits and pieces. So, for instance, if you're a newspaper writer and you're going on to do some video, you don't need any adverbs. You don't need any adjectives. You don't need to describe. Your pictures describe. You don't have to say, the woman cried. You can see her crying. So I call that writing to the corners of your pictures. As a writer, you can show them things they can't see, they can't hear. You can add information. Like, for instance, if you have a huge tornado or a series of tornadoes that come through Oklahoma, and they go through eastern Oklahoma and they spread out for 5 miles, through a pine forest, and you get there early in the morning, you can say you could smell the path of the storm before you could see it. 5 miles wide through a pine forest from McAllister to the Texas border. Now, you've told them something that you can't get in natural sound. You can't shoot pictures of until you finally get to the point where you see some downed trees. But you've set the scene using building blocks. Vice versa. If you're a television type and you're suddenly out and having to do 2,000 words for the web page or something, It's not enough to just to talk about what you shot. You have to add in other things. Like, for instance, you're on a day 3 flood and the water's gone down. You might tell them that there's dust on the apple sitting on the kitchen sink, and it's the high water mark of the water in this house. We don't care there's a high water mark in Tulsa or McAllister. You can see that on the map. But if it's Bill Jones's house and he's got mud on his apple in the kitchen on the second shelf, that's adding detail to it. See, it's adding all the stuff that you can't do with your picture. Now, if you're a laptop journalist, obviously you're also going to take a picture of that. But it's in. You see, it's the hey. You got to get their attention. This is about you. You have a house. You got apples. You've seen high water. See, this is what I found out about it, and so why should you care? Because it could happen to you. On and on and on. But you can rob a lot of time out of your day by just using the rule of 3s. For instance, if you go out to ask questions, people expect that you're going to be some kind of tool from the Daily Oklahoman or Channel 4, and they get scared. So you fill up your newspaper and your television station with people who are professional sound bites, more than happy to give you exactly what you need. The only problem with that is they're in everybody else's paper and everybody else's airwaves. So you've got to go find ordinary people like Chuck, right? Well, how do you bring them out? Well, I perfected another thing that I use to make my day a whole lot more efficient, and that's the non-question question. For instance, I learned this when I was very young from an NBC photographer. We were out, the Shah of Iran was dying, and his son was over in West Texas going to flight school. And everybody wanted a soundbite from his son, the story, except they had him, walled off. And we were all staked out there for our live shots and, dancing, saying nothing for hours on end. And finally, we left it with the cameraman and went off to get some lunch for everybody. Came back, and Scotty Berner says, well, I got your soundbite and the whole picture story with the Shah of Iran's kid. I said, really? And he says, yeah, and these other guys didn't get it. They're going to have to interview me. I said, what'd you do? And he said, well, I was standing here like we all been doing for hours, and I looked down the road, and I saw a kid who looked like he didn't grow up in Lubbock. So I wandered down to him, and I didn't say, hi, I'm Scotty Berner, I'm an NBC tool. Had my camera on the shoulder. He knew exactly who I was. But he was looking at flowers. And so I went up to him and I said, I love flowers. I love chrysanthemums. He says, the only flower I knew was a chrysanthemum. It happened to be one. And the kid said, I like flowers too. And so Scotty said, my dad liked flowers. And the kid said, my dad loves flowers. And Scotty says, my dad died last year, which was a true story. And the kid said, my dad is very sick. Soundbite, 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 soundbite. Scotty never once asked him a question. He got him comfortable talking about something that he was looking at and then guided his thinking back to the point. All right? But he still wasn't sure this was the Shah of Iran's kid until like 4 bodyguards hopped up over the hedge and went, oh, my dad, there wasn't going on. And they came right down, Well, Scotty didn't turn around and start arguing his First Amendment freedoms with guys who were holding their Second Amendment freedoms. He just turned the camera on and started shooting cutaways. And finally he asked him, he says, after they were, carrying the kid back in, he says, was that the Shah of Iran's kid? Yeah. Got it. Walked back, dumped it in. The guys from CBS and ABC had to interview Scotty that night. Well, what did he say? Write it into their stories. It's the non-question. So the rule of 3s and the non-question. The non-question can bring people out who are not professional storytellers all the time because they're expecting just the opposite. Now, I don't think I'm telling you guys anything you don't already know. I'm convinced of that. But we lose sight of it because we get so busy doing the minutia. And I'll tell you what will scare you in a few years. It's already scared me. Everything I learned in college, every tool I learned how to use is now in a museum. Typewriters, film glue, white gloves, film processors. I'm not saying to be a Luddite You know, you've got to learn the technology, but that isn't the story. The techniques of telling a story haven't changed since Jesus wept. They didn't write Jesus, man from Nazareth, wearing a cardigan, age 31. They had subject and a strong verb. And if you do that, you got time for the natural sound. You got time for the sound bites. You got time for the pictures to carry. You know, if they give you 2 minutes, you don't put wall-to-wall words in there. That's the hardest thing for you newspaper types to figure it out. And sometimes really tough for our television people because, you know, we've spent all day on this. But, you know, Mark Twain used to write letters to his friends, and he'd say, I'm sorry this letter's so long. I didn't have time to write a short one. But in our day and age, with the attention span about a -3 seconds, you know, sometimes 12 words properly done is all you really need. But more importantly, if you're working in multimedia, it gives you more time for all the other grace notes, the natural sound, the pictures, the transitions, you know, whatever, that help to further the story. And it's not a question of, you know, we used to call it car wars. The reporters would be yelling at the cameramen and saying, we have the true religion, and vice versa. It has nothing to do with it. You have to think of them as all of these are building blocks laid out on the table. And given whatever you're working on, sometimes the written word is the most important thing. Sometimes a picture needs to go in there. Sometimes a piece of natural sound. Sometimes, you know, but the way we're doing it now, it really is, it's swinging back towards the storytellers because with this DVR technology and the fact that you can click ever deeper into a story, you can have your big think piece. And then you can say, well, what was that about? So you hit a picture and it has a sound bite in there or a little more information. It's like like an encyclopedia. The beauty of it is that we can now go back in depth, like we all got into business to do to begin with, and we're kind of getting away from everybody just screaming headlines all the time, because there's just so many that you can do before people kind of go, well, what was that? Who told me that? I don't remember. And then they start laying off staff. But if you're a storyteller, they'll keep coming back. I want to show you one other piece here. It talks about the non-question question and see if you can figure it out.
The past is more precious to those who have more of it. Ed Lucas hasn't missed an opening day at Yankee Stadium in 51 years.
I don't want to give you any advice on that.
He's a sports reporter covering a game he cannot see. Ed lost his sight in 1951 on a legendary day in baseball history.
My father was sitting there, actually with his rosary beads in his hand, praying
For his beloved Giants to beat Brooklyn. They were watching baseball's first nationally televised game. Bottom of the ninth, Bobby Thompson at the plate.
My father jumped up, he was screaming, I was screaming.
Then, running outside to celebrate, a 12-year-old twirling to TV cheers. Ed fired a fastball to a friend with a bat.
The line drive came back and boom, hit me right between the eyes.
Destroying his retinas.
It was the end of the world. What did a blind person do? That was my biggest fear.
The next year, Ed enrolled at St. Joseph, a boarding school for the blind in New Jersey. One snowy afternoon, his dad showed up to take him home for the weekend. Knelt down to help him put on a pair of galoshes. But a nun stopped him.
She said, he's only blind. He's not handicapped. He can put him on himself. When he puts him on himself, you can leave. And an hour and a half later, we left.
Determined to stay close to the game he loved. But memories only take you so far. Soon, Ed had 2 young sons to raise after an early marriage failed and his wife left.
You thought your dad had superhuman powers. He used to be able to turn off the lights, and we'd sit in bed and he'd read to us with the lights on.
Yankee Stadium became their second home, while Dad did feature stories for New Jersey radio stations.
How can a guy who's blind cover sports?
It was difficult. It took years.
To learn new ballparks. But players helped. Former Mets right fielder Ron Swoboda once interrupted Ed's questions to ask one of his own.
Do you know what a ball diamond looks like?
He said, let's take a walk.
You're in Shea Stadium. There's a little more than a ball diamond here, so...
Then we walked out and he said, put your hand out. And I felt the wall.
And his kindness.
Why do you keep coming back for it that took your sight?
Well, baseball took my sight, but baseball also gave me back my life.
Yankee Hall of Famer Phil Rizzuto set up a happy ending.
It's absolutely beautiful.
He introduced Ed to Allison, a fan with failing.
I'm not talking, I know they were either walking or kissing, I can usually figure that out for myself.
Was it love at first? Well, what, you know.
Yeah. I think so. He's my Prince Charming.
They got married this spring in a fairy tale place, Yankee Stadium.
I'll be the luckiest woman on the face of the earth.
Ed stood where his heroes have all stood, home plate. As always, his sons were at his side.
Life is like the game of baseball. You play it every day.
I had to go through a very dark winter, going blind, and going through that as a 12-year-old, but he's had a great spring, a great summer, and now in the fall, he's going to have a lot of fun.
Dad, you may kiss the bride.
Yankee Stadium holds a lot of special memories, but none like this. The day a blind man stepped to the plate and won the game of life.
You made it, Kev.
What's that?
For today, Bob Dotson, NBC News, with an American story at Yankee Stadium.
All the other television people did that as a live shot and 20-second VO. But fortunately, the people who signed my paycheck decided to actually hear the story. And you know, whether you're in newspapers or television, we're always asking for more time, more space. And what I did for almost 2 years when I first joined the Today Show to get off of the run and gun stuff was I brought in, every time I worked for the Today newscast, even though in those days a minute 10 was about the length everybody wanted, and everyone was calling in overnight for minute 20, minute 30, minute 45, I went 2 years and always brought it into 59 seconds. Until one day I called them up and I said, I think I got a really good story, and they gave me an unlimited time. It's not a question of length, it's a question of storytelling. If you've got a story there, a 6-minute story feels like about 30 seconds. And if you don't, if you're just putting together the facts that you've grabbed, you know, a 30-second VO, besides being a ho-hummer, can take you forever. So I always, even if I'm just doing a very, very short piece, and study commercials. I mean, in 20 seconds, they can tell you a story. So, or a trailer that you really think works well in a movie theater. You know, look at the storytelling, the visual story. How do they move it along so that it still gets you here, and keeps you engaged? Well, they're just working with the same set of stuff. And I go back to all the things that they taught you in English class, which is every story has a scene setter. Every story has a little foreshadowing. It could be a joke about going blind. Every story has some conflict, even a 20-second VO. But in our business, everything's conflict. So that's not hard to find. And then it has to have a little character growth. Something has to happen. You see, this guy got a little smarter. He figured out life. And then you have to have a resolution. Happens in every story we do. If it fails, the movie fails. If it fails, your newspaper article failed. If it fails, your news story isn't watched on television because they've clicked over to CNN. But if it's not, you'll get emails and people will say, you made me late for work again this morning. Because they get hooked on the story. And in television, I know, they always want you to be the story. They want you riding the elephant. But that gets really old. And in newspaper journalism, you know, started back in the 60s, where suddenly it was, what does the reporter think about this? And I understand that's in vogue, and you have to go with what's in vogue. But what's more important is you have to find a really good story. And you can do that with the rule of threes and all the things we've been talking about, because you can dig a little deeper even in your 10 or 15 seconds. So let's take a look at one piece that I did, and then talk about building a story, and then I'll give you some minutes to ask some questions. This was done in a little town in Kansas, and it's because they wouldn't send me to Poland. I wanted to go to Poland.
The keys to history's treasures are often found in unexpected places. This one turned up in a tiny Kansas town, unlocking a story half a world away.
To my dear and beloved girls very close to my heart.
Irina Sendler saved 2,500 children from the Nazi death camps during World War II. She saved her story 60 years for the first child who asked why she risked her life.
My parents have taught me that if someone is drowning, one always needs to give a helping hand and rescue them.
Megan Felt and her friends were putting together a play for their high school history club and found a brief mention of Mrs. Sendler.
It's like it took a hold of us, and we couldn't quit. We wanted to know more. We wanted to dig deeper.
So they went to Poland to meet her.
That's a beautiful picture.
And this is the high school play she helped them write.
Isaac, Hannah, this nice lady is going to take you someplace safe.
In 1940, the Nazis walled off a neighborhood near Irina Sendler's home in Warsaw, pressed almost 500,000 people into an area the size of New York Central Park, with not enough food to keep them alive. 5,000 were dying each month. Sendler, a Catholic nurse, bluffed her way inside.
We can walk right past the German officers.
I lost no time on reflecting, knowing that I and my heart had to be there to come to the rescue.
She's only 5 feet tall.
She's less than 5 feet tall. Yes. And she's walking out of the ghetto with gunny sacks and driving out hygiene trucks with babies sedated.
The tiny ones she'd put in boxes, and sometimes they would make noise, but she had a dog sitting beside her. What did she do in order to cover up the cracks?
If they got close to the child, she would hit the dog on the paw and it would start to bark and cause chaos, so they had to let her go through. Children, take my hand.
She took the children to Catholic families who agreed to raise them as their own, but wrote their real names on cigarette papers and put them in a jar, which she buried beneath an apple tree across the street from the Nazi barracks.
I know you were not the mother of that child.
One day, Irina Sendler was betrayed, arrested, both her feet and legs broken, almost murdered. But she never revealed where she'd taken the kids. After the war, she quietly dug up the jars and, true to her word, began returning the children to surviving relatives.
One person has the ability to change people.
Mrs. Sendler had a question for you girls. She wondered why you would care when you came from a place that didn't have a Jewish family for miles and miles and miles.
Race, religion, creed, it didn't matter to us. What mattered was good can triumph over evil.
Mrs. Sendler bid them goodbye with a bit of advice. Become like the farmers back here in Kansas, she said. Don't sow seed for food, sow the seeds for good. And try to make that circle of good around you bigger and bigger every day.
This will all end someday.
So the curtain never came down on their little play.
Sign your name, please.
Not even after they graduated, got jobs, got married.
We're trying to repair the world.
Norm Kennard, their high school history teacher, has watched them perform in more than 200 schools.
They're reaching over the walls of bias and prejudice that adults could never attempt to reach over.
Telling the tale of a 97-year-old woman that might have been lost forever had it not been for some small-town kids intent on rescuing the rescuer's story.
I can only follow the need of my heart.
For today, Bob Dotson, NBC News, with an American story in Uniontown, Kansas.
After that story ran, Mrs. Sendler was nominated for a Nobel Prize. She lost to Al Gore. In the great scope, I had nothing against Mr. Gore, but in the great scope of things, you know. A 5'1" nurse, and look what she did. Hey, this story is found in an unusual place. This story is not about some little old lady you can't understand in Poland. This is about kids in a small Kansas town. that journalists have been asking Mrs. Sindler for years for an interview. Writers for books wanted an interview. They knew what she had done. She never told them. But the kids wrote her a letter, a non-question question. And pretty soon, she wrote back 38 letters to them with the details. And then when they went over to see her, they also got to meet some of the kids she had saved. Mrs. Sindler now, of course, she's 98, and she's in a retirement home. And the lead nurse is one of the babies she carried out in a box. I would have had that in my story, but as you see, I was relying on their home movies, and they were out of focus on that part. But of course, for my story for the Daily Oklahoman, I could add that in there. You see what I mean? I'm talking about building blocks. You build a story with what you've got. But in some cases, the challenges and the restrictions actually end up as a better story. It's an American story about kids. You've been a kid. You know a kid. You come from high school. You know, you don't go the other way. And 9 out of 10 other folks would have gone out like I thought I would do it first and go to, you know, see Mrs. Sindler, and here I am sitting there going, I'm Bob, and she doesn't speak English, but you're going to really enjoy her story. You know, it just doesn't work. You know, but if you do it from the other side, it does. So, the scene setter, this is Kansas. This is not Warsaw. It's about us. The foreshadowing. The keys to history's treasures are often found in unexpected places. This one turned up in a tiny Kansas town, unlocking a story half a world away. To illustrate that, and you do this in the newspapers as well, she had all the letters, this little girl. So we just spread them out and took pictures of them. But we made sure we also got extreme close-ups of the fact that they were from Poland. Now, it's a grace note. It's not something that draws attention to itself, but it's the difference between hearing your favorite group performing a song and then going out and hearing the same song at the Ramada Inn out on the interstate. Right? It's the grace notes that make for a great story. But thinking visually, and we were really, you know, challenged on this story, how do you do it? We had a high school play. Badly done. But once we've established what it's all about, then nobody cares that it's badly done because they're hooked on the story. And then I called up, you know, Spielberg's folks, and he let us have some of the black and white footage, and off we go. You know, there are ways of putting it together, but you have to think visually even before you start a story like that. So scene setter, foreshadowing, the conflict, not just World War II, but how could small-town kids overcome distance and difference in lives? Remember, there wasn't a Jewish family within 100 miles. How do you get small-town kids to not only relate to this story, not just ancient history, but to see the human side of it and bring that out? Conflict. The character growth, well, it's a history club assignment. One person has the ability to change the world. And now these kids are in their late 20s and been doing it for a decade. That's character growth. And the resolution? Telling the tale of a 97-year-old woman that might have been lost forever had it not been for small-town kids intent on rescuing the rescuer's story. A lot of people who don't write for a living think that it's magic, and they say, you know, they hear something really well-turned phrase, and they say, oh, I can't do that. Or they try too hard, and they get it, you know, it's kind of get like purple prose. But the truth of the matter is, if you've done all this research, I'm just telling them what happened. It's a 97-year-old, I'm summing it up. It's the hey, you see, so. So why should you care? It's a 97-year-old woman who has this tale that small-town kids are intent in rescuing. Because I was realizing there's a parallel story going along into this old piece. There's a story of what happened in World War II. There's also the story of what these kids are doing. Why were they successful when this whole group of people could have written her a letter? And a lot of them did. And they wouldn't talk to us because we weren't asking the non-question question. We were saying, hi, I'm Bob Dotson from NBC News, and I'd like to sit next to you and pretend like I know you. You know, maybe the pat cliche way we do things on television and the newspapers over and over again are our worst enemy. When basically what we're trying to do is to pop out the unexpected from people. And I'm not talking good news. I'm not Jerry Falwell. I could give a darn about that. I think you need to approach ordinary people like you would the governor, especially if he's governor of New York. Because you come up with stuff all the time which is so different than where everybody else in the room is looking. So you can keep your job for a long, long time. And we've got about 10 minutes, so I'm going to ask some questions, but when we wrap it up, I'll show you the one other piece, and I'll set it up with a little foreshadowing. I think it's so important to look in the corners where everybody else does not. And I don't think of myself as a feature reporter. I could care less whether it's good news or it's pleasant or it's a nice kicker. I don't. Sometimes it happens that way. But what I want to do is to go get people who have significant stories to tell and put them out there so that we feel, I mean, it's part of the puzzle news that we don't cover. It's a beat that we seldom cover until until a kid falls down the well. Then we go to ordinary people. And we say, boy, your kid fell down the well, how do you feel? But we don't know what else happened in life, and I'm telling you, as a survival technique, I mean, I've survived for 33 years at NBC with this, not counting tomorrow, and almost 40 years since I came here to Channel 4. And that's because every time I get a chance, and I know you've got to fulfill what the job requirement is, whatever it is, you've got to do it every day. But when you get a second, all you got to do is have one or two of these once in a while. And it makes your career because they think, well, you're showing us. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've talked to people and they say, well, why are you here at my doorstep? Because I don't matter. I don't see what I do on television. I don't read about it in the newspapers. And I said, well, let me just chat with you and see if there's something there that might. And, of course, immediately you find all these other layers all the time. And it's not something that the spin doctors will hand you along with every other person in town. Anybody got a question?
How about a quick one? Your storytelling is very compelling and your reporting is outstanding. I'm curious about the production time, what's it was, because you've got, look back, someone obviously did a lot of research, say like on the baseball, blind baseball player. You've got footage of him at the ballpark. You've got the wedding, the reception. You've got a lot of old stuff. You went back to the St. Joe's School for the Blind. So there's a lot of time involved in putting all that together.
Right.
So how many people work on that project besides just your reporting?
Well, the real question you're asking is, the reason I can't do it is because I don't have as much time or resources as you have.
Well,
I mean, right. It's absolutely true. You don't. No.
It takes a lot of time to do that.
It is. It is. And it's more like a documentary than it is news. The short answer to your question is we have a lot of people working on it, and it takes a lot of time. But the real answer is, and we all know this in journalism, it takes as much time as you have. I've done production like that in an afternoon. I mean, obviously you can't go to 12 different places, but it's a way you approach something. If you're efficient in what you're looking for, you can put a couple of grace notes in. Or maybe the better analogy is that's an oil painting. But if you have to paint in watercolors, you can make the same impression with 4 brief strokes. It's a way of approaching something. It's like it's a philosophy of how I work, and most of the people who do stories that are memorable work. If you've only got 20 minutes, I mean, for all during the 90s, I had to do the stories for Nightly News, and they would shave 2 seconds off here and 5 seconds off there, and nothing was over a minute 20, sometimes 2 minutes if you did it in depth. And they would change. You'd be marching all day long trying to do something. And remember, we have to physically get there too. We're always lost. It's not like you know how to get to the cop shop here in town. So you add in all that, you actually have less time. And then the water walkers in New York, they go, well, we really don't want to do it on gray shirts. We want to do it on blue shirts, but still be, So you're constantly, wong. But then I go into the watercolors and I find the 5 little things that are going to work for that. And it's the same, I mean, my point is it's the same if you're breaking news and it's just you and you've got 12 other things to do that day. If you think it through, you say, I'm going to need this, 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 and this. I've only got 5 minutes, so this is how I'm going to get those. But the other thing is that when people are given longer stories, you've seen this in the newspaper or on TV. Oh, yeah, we're going to do you could work on the new magazine show. Well, guy comes back and he's got like 16 pounds of interviews and no pictures. And he thinks that's going to make it. Well, that isn't going to work either. I mean, it's all... Everything has to change, but you have to get it. This piece I'm going to show you, which might give you a case in point, we went down, we shot it in 2 hours and in one location, and we were in an hour in the other location, and the rest of the time was flying time. But we were amazed that the award that was given out every year at the University of Michigan for the best surgeon was named after a guy who is not a doctor. That's the press release that came out. And they said, it's this guy. And of course, the press release was about the guy who was getting the award that year. But there had been like 57 guys that had gotten this award since it got started. And this is the story. And this was shot in about, in real time, I'd say about, well, I can't show you anything. It's locked up. Well, let's try it again. But anyway, while that's heating up, has anybody else got a question? Yes.
How long did it take before you believed and others believed as well that you were a good storyteller?
Not counting tomorrow. You have to keep reinventing yourself. I mean, there's no institutional memory. So when I was doing spot news all during the 90s, everybody forgot that I done any kind of storytelling. And when I was at the network, they didn't remember I did documentaries. I mean, it's a long distance run, and nobody has anything forever. But like I said, when I wanted to do longer pieces, but rather than go and ask for longer pieces, I did everything for 59 seconds until they asked me to do something longer, and then I could throw that back in. And I used all my documentary techniques that in these stories, because they would be different. In other words, instead of following the governor, so the governor says, I'm going to ask for some money from the federal government because there's a lot of flooding along the Illinois River. I might go for 15 seconds with just a woman with a tear coming down her cheek, and then finally reveal what she's looking at, which is the flooded river where her son disappeared last night. It's a documentary technique. Everybody else would do, here's a little wide shot, here's the governor saying, oh, it's terrible, I've just been over it and I saw it was terrible. And then, one thing is certain, the money might come, might not, and they're all going to rebuild tomorrow. And I mean, if you've seen the story, if it plays out in your mind and you've seen it 1,000 times, probably not a good idea to do it exactly the same way, because what's the point? And also keeps you awake. I mean, if you're in this business as long as I am, it's better to be awake. But you've done every story. And I'm convinced now there are only 4 people in the world, and we all circle by each other all the time. And secondly, I think there's only 6 stories. I mean, the names change, location changes, but it's the same thing. And how do you stay awake for the next, 30 years of your career? Well, that's to say, okay, what's going on over here? I mean, what's another angle that I can pull it in? I did a story on these guys that found the submarine up around Alaska that had been missing for 40 years, and these 3 brothers did the whole bit forever. And you may have seen it in USA Today just last week, because thank you very much. But this Craig Wilson, you ever read him on his final word on the USA Today? It's a columnist. Well, he convinced the people who signed paychecks that even though this story is now 18 months old, I've been following it forever, to go back and do a piece on the women who searched out all the guys that went, all the relatives of all the people who disappeared with this ship. And then do, on the web page, you could actually click and you could find the people in your neighborhood. And so suddenly all these people became like 16-year-old, 17-year-old boys again, And he found a whole new way of doing it. It wasn't, I was there for the whole thing where they dragged it up, and the 3 boys that found it who are now in their 70s, and how thrilled they were and all that, and all the great underwater photography. But 6 months later, Craig figured out a way that there's no way television could do that. Maybe you could do it on your webpage, but you'd never be given the time. So he did the cover article on the feature section of the USA Today, and then you could go to their webpage to click to find out if there's anybody in your neighborhood. And it was beautifully put together, and now it's archived forever, and it's going to be there for people to click on. It's just terrific. So, that's why I say no matter what you've got an ability to, to use these building blocks in all kinds of different places. So here's the final story if this thing actually comes up. And this was shot basically in about 3 hours.
They're often found in unexpected places.
Oh, now you're playing it.
You can't always tell about a car by its polish. Same with people. Folks in Forest, Mississippi know Jimmy Crudup is good with his hands. But few know what magic they can do. This former truck driver with only a high school education taught surgery for 30 years.
Yeah, I couldn't stand sight blood.
And you don't like needles?
Don't like needles.
What are you doing on an operating room?
I had a family to take care and 1,000 miles away from home, and I had to have a job.
When the trucking business hit a hard time, Jimmy took a job cleaning medical tools at a research lab here at the University of Michigan. He watched the surgeons working, and it all seemed as simple to him as rewiring his old car. So one day he borrowed the doctor's books and began teaching himself.
I heard some of the older surgeons talking about this amazing guy, Jimmy. He just watched what these guys were doing, and he did it better than them.
Sherman Silver was a Michigan med student in the 1960s, struggling when he asked Jimmy for help.
I was terrified because I had no manual ability whatsoever.
Dr. Silver became one of the pioneers of microsurgery, now one of the leading fertility specialists. Techniques he perfected with tools Jimmy made for him.
Jimmy explained to me it's all in the mind and the brain. It's not really in the hands.
They practiced on rats.
Once you could do a heart transplant on a rat, it's not a big deal to do a testicle transplant on a human.
Of course, Jimmy was not allowed to work on people, but
the other professors didn't know how to do microsurgery.
So they started sending students to learn what only Jimmy could teach.
What was the reaction of the young doctors when they were sent to see you?
They didn't know that I was black. They would come over and they said, well, where's Jimmy? I just say, you're looking at it.
Jimmy had a way of making it pretty obvious by the end of one or two operations that he knew a lot more about this than they did, and then the whole relationship would change.
Why didn't you become a doctor yourself?
I had a speech problem. I stuttered really bad. But I was just determined that I was going to break myself and study because I was in a new environment.
He did. By then, he was in his late 30s and had 4 children to raise, and all those students.
You helped so many doctors to greater fortune than your own.
Mm-hmm.
What did you get out of all this?
Well, I knew these doctors was going to be operating on humans. And my reward out of it is that they made them better doctors and they saved a lot of lives,
Jimmy's example continues to inspire. Dr. Jules Lynn is the best surgical student this year at the University of Michigan. His name will go on a plaque that bears Jimmy's face.
It's perhaps our most important teaching award in the laboratory, and it's named after our most important teacher that we've ever had in the laboratory.
Jimmy's retired now, living back in Mississippi. At 79, still taking care of people.
You been feeling all right?
To his neighbors, he's just that quiet old guy who can fix anything. Jimmy seldom mentions what he's done. What he's done speaks for itself. For today, Bob Dotson, NBC News, with an American story in Forest, Mississippi.
How he did what he did. The other thing he didn't quite say on camera, which when I asked him that question about what he got out of it, he said, the first time, he said, well, I'm 79. One of these days I'm going to be laying out there, and I want one of my students working on me. I never got him to say it exactly the same way, but it's personal there, you see. And for people, who are struggling every day, who are watching and reading about, where do I fit in this world? I got a lot of problems. What can I do? And then you throw something in there like, well, here's Jimmy, and he did what he had to do, and he's quiet and he's humble and everybody loves him, and you need to throw that in the mix. But I'm telling you, the press release was, come to Michigan because this guy is getting the Jimmy Sudduth Award. And I kept thinking, well, who's Jimmy Sudduth? Because, we were looking at it and we said, well, I don't see any Dr. Jimmy Sudduth. No. And then we said, well, he's retired. Well, where is he? He's down in Mississippi. So we flew to Mississippi, had like an hour. He got on the plane, flew up there. Because, we don't have, it looks like we got an unlimited budget because it's a network. But we got, 6 million people watching and another 12 million on the internet. So they got budgets. But we still get the same thing. People, I'm going to speak tomorrow to the National Press Photographers, and one of the things people always come up with is, well, yeah, if you have that money and this, that, and the other. And what they do down there, it's almost like video boot camp. They say, you got to shoot 5 minutes of tape, no more. You have to edit it to 59 seconds. You can't use audio. And when you show it to the professors and the other classmates, you've got one sentence to set it up. You can edit it, but you got one sentence. And we don't care if you stage it. We don't care if you have the sun coming up in the west. We don't care. Because basically what they want to do is to knock out all the excuses that we all build up. You know, if I had more time, if I had to... The question I always ask is, how come that guy gets to go to the Olympics and I'm not? How come that guy got the beat and I didn't? And it isn't because, you know, he's dating the boss's daughter. Maybe it is. That sometimes happens. But by and large, it's because they started somewhere where they only had 2 tools. But they made the best of it. And the only piece of advice that I kept it in my wallet for years till it fell apart, was in a chocolate bar that was sitting on a little pillow in some hotel room. And it said, success is not a question of being dealt a good hand. It's playing a bad hand well over and over and over again. So if you're waiting for all the tools to come to your lap and all the time in the world, it's never going to happen. The people who hang out in our business for a long, long time, whether they got 10 seconds, whether they got to be in the newspaper today or tomorrow they're going to be on TV or the next, you know, whatever. They give it a shot, they figure out, and they go to school on people who are doing it well. I mean, I do that every day. You know, if there's somebody that would really impress me, you know, in a grocery store or whatever, I'm figuring, what the heck do they do that everybody else in the world doesn't? And then it's sort of like, you know, I did a story on a bunch of guys who were raising alligators after the alligators taken off the endangered species list. And I said, how long you been doing it? The guy said, 5 years. And we're walking along with all these alligators who I hope had been well fed while we're doing a little walk and talk interview. And that's when he announces that an alligator can outrun an Olympic sprinter for 100 yards. I think, you know, now he tells me. And he says, but don't worry about it. All you have to do is be faster than the slowest guy in your group. And that's pretty much sums up about journalists in this room, right? If you want to have an interesting, fun, long career, all you got to do is be just a little fast. You don't have to be terrific. All you got to do is be a little faster. And if you take that philosophy, first of all, you're going to stay awake. And secondly, no matter how fast these things change, you'll figure out a way to survive in it because you're a storyteller. You're no longer a camera person or an anchor person or a sound person or whatever. You're just back to what we all were when we first got out of journalism school, just telling stories. Thank you all very much.